At 508 East 2nd Street in Villisca, Iowa, there is a wood frame house on a residential block where most of the neighbors would have known the family inside it by name. The house sits in a town of approximately 2,500 people in the southwestern corner of the state, and in the early hours of June 10, 1912, it looked the way it always looked, modest, ordinary, the kind of house that registers as familiar rather than remarkable, a structure among others on a quiet street where the lights had long since gone dark. 8 people were asleep inside it. The town around it was still. The head of the household was Josiah B. Moore, 36 years old, who had built a working life in Villisca through the kind of steady commercial effort that left a recognizable imprint on a small town's economy. He had begun his career as a sales agent for the John Deere Plow Company, which placed him in the implement trade at an early age and gave him a working knowledge of the business that would shape his professional decisions in the years that followed. At some point prior to 1912, Moore departed from that employment and established his own implement dealership in Villisca, a competing enterprise that drew on the same market, the same farmers, the same seasonal rhythms of equipment need. The dealership operated from a building in town. Moore was known in the community, commercially active, and by all documented accounts an established presence in Villisca's civic and commercial life. He was 36 years old on the night of June 9th, 1912. His wife was Sarah Montgomery Moore, age 39. The couple had 6 children, ranging in age from infancy to early adolescence. Herman was 11, Mary Catherine was 10, Arthur was 7, Paul was 5. Boyd was 2. The youngest child was Lena Gertrude, still an infant. The Moore home at 508 East 2nd Street housed all of them, 2 adults, 6 children, in a family arrangement that was not unusual for the time or the place, a full household in a modest structure in a small Midwestern town, the kind of domestic fact that would have required no particular notation by anyone who knew them. The family occupied the upstairs bedrooms in the configuration typical of the house's layout, the children distributed through those rooms in whatever arrangement a family of that size had worked out over years of ordinary domestic life. Sarah Moore was, by the documented record, involved in the local Presbyterian church. The Children's Day program held at that church on the evening of June 9th. 1912 was a community event of the kind that a town of Villisca's size produced regularly, a gathering that brought families together in a shared public space, with children performing recitations and presentations before an assembled congregation. Sarah Moore had been involved in helping organize the program. Several of the Moore children participated in it. The evening of June 9th was, in those respects, a social evening of unremarkable character for the family. Attendance at a community event they had helped bring together, the children performing, the congregation present, the families of the town gathered in the way that small towns gathered for such occasions. Among those at the program that evening were 2 sisters, Lena Stillinger, age 12, and Ina Stillinger, age 8. They were the daughters of a local farmer named Joseph Stillinger, and they were known to the Moore family in the way that families in a town of 2,500 people tend to know one another, through proximity, through church, through the overlapping social networks of a small and largely self-contained community. At the close of the Children's Day program on the evening of June 9th, an arrangement was made between the families, informal in the way that such arrangements are informal, the kind of invitation extended and accepted without particular ceremony. The Stillinger girls would spend the night at the Moore home. The walk or short journey to 508 East 2nd Street that followed would have been unremarkable. The evening had gone well. The program had concluded. The congregation had dispersed, and the Stillinger girls left with the Moores to spend a summer night in the downstairs guest room of the family home. They were 12 and 8 years old. It was an ordinary arrangement in a town that managed such arrangements as a matter of ordinary social life. What the record shows is simply that the invitation was made, that the girls accepted it, and that by the end of that evening, they were inside the Moore house on East 2nd Street, along with the 6 more children and the 2 more adults, 8 people in a house that had settled for the night in the familiar, unexceptional way of a family home after a long summer evening. The Moore home in the summer of 1912 was a structure of its time and place, a modest Midwestern frame house on a residential street, the kind of building that provided shelter and warmth and the ordinary functions of family life without drawing particular attention to itself. The street it sat on was a street in a small Iowa town, the houses along it occupied by people who would have recognized one another by sight and by name, the rhythms of the neighborhood shaped by the small regularities of work and school and church and seasonal change. In June of 1912, the days were long and the evenings were warm, and a Children's Day program at the local Presbyterian church was exactly the kind of community event that structured the social calendar of such a town, and the Moores' involvement in it was exactly the kind of civic participation that gave a family its place in a community's life. Josiah Moore had not always been his own employer. His years with the John Deere Plow Company had given him the practical foundations of the farm implement business, an understanding of the products, the customers, the seasonal patterns of agricultural commerce in the middle of the country. Southwestern Iowa in the early 20th century was farming country, and farming country ran on equipment, and equipment ran on the dealers and sales agents who moved between town and farm, between inventory and customer, across the working landscape of the rural Midwest. Moore had inhabited that world as an employee before he inhabited it as a proprietor. His decision to open his own dealership placed him in direct competition with interests he had previously served, and the business he built in Villisca was, by the record's account, a functioning commercial enterprise in a town where agricultural commerce was the center of economic life. Sarah Moore's life centered on the household and the church in the pattern that the record suggests was common to her time and position. The Children's Day program she had helped organize was one expression of that involvement, of visible participation in the community's shared religious and social life, the kind of labor that supported institutions without appearing prominently in the documentary record, except at the edges of other accounts. She was 39 years old. She had 6 children, aged 2 years to 11 years. The household at 508 East 2nd Street was by any ordinary measure a full and active one, and the evening of June 9th, 1912, was the evening of a successful community event in which her family had played a visible part. The Stillinger girls arrived at the Moore home at the close of that evening as guests of the family by the documented arrangement made at the church. Lena was 12 and Ina was 8, and they were assigned the downstairs guest room, the room where visitors to the house slept, separate from the upstairs bedrooms where the Moore family members were distributed for the night. 6 children in the upper rooms, 2 adults in the main bedroom, 2 guests in the downstairs room. The household's nighttime configuration on June 9th into June 10th is documented in the record of what investigators found the following morning, and from that record it is possible to trace back to the ordinary domestic logic of the arrangement. A family home organized for a night that included 2 additional young guests, the rooms allocated in the practical and unremarkable way of a household that was used to children. Investigators and subsequent researchers concluded, from what was known of the evening's events and the confirmed timeline of the program at the Presbyterian Church, that the household was likely asleep by approximately 10:30 to 11 o'clock in the evening. The Children's Day program would have ended at a reasonable hour. The walk or journey home would have been short. And the settling of a household that included children ranging from an infant to a 12-year-old would have followed the ordinary domestic logic of putting young people to bed after a full evening. 8 people in a house dispersed through its upstairs and downstairs rooms in the late June dark of a small Iowa town. Villisca in 1912 was a functioning community, a railroad town, an agricultural service center, a place with churches and schools and commercial streets, and the layered social life of a community that had been in place long enough to develop its own particular rhythms and institutions. 2,500 people was not a large population, but it was enough to sustain a visible civic life, enough that a family like the Moores would have been known figures in the community without being notable beyond it. The town had the Presbyterian Church, where the Children's Day program had taken place. It had the residential streets where families lived and knew one another. It had the commercial district where Josiah Moore ran his dealership. It was a place with a settled, recognizable shape, and the Moores were a settled, recognizable part of it. The Children's Day program at the Presbyterian Church on the evening of June 9th, 1912, had been an annual tradition of the kind that marks time in a community's calendar. Families arrived for the occasion. Children performed their recitations. The congregation assembled in the shared space of the church that served not only as a place of worship, but as a gathering point for the social life of its members. Sarah Moore had helped organize the evening. The Moore children had participated in it. The Stillinger girls had been there as members of the congregation or attendees at the event. At the close of the program, the arrangement had been made. The girls would come to 508 East 2nd Street for the night. The evening had proceeded in the way that summer evenings at small-town church events proceeded, and its conclusion had followed naturally from its beginning, and the Moore house had received its 2 additional guests in the ordinary way of a family home on a summer night. What the record shows in its careful documentation of the household's likely state in the final hours of June 9th, 1912, is a house that had settled into the ordinary quiet of nighttime. The children would have been put to bed in the sequence that a household with 6 children and 2 guests managed such things. The younger ones first, the older ones following, the adults retiring after the household had gone quiet. The infant Lena Gertrude, who was too young to have participated in the evening's program, would have been in her customary sleeping arrangement. Boyd, at 2 years old, would have been settled for the night. The older children, Herman at 11, Mary Catherine at 10, Arthur at 7, Paul at 5, were old enough to have been present for the program and would have been settled in their rooms in the upstairs of the house. Lena and Ina Stillinger, in the downstairs guest room, would have had whatever conversation and arrangement 2 girls of 12 and 8 make when they are guests in a house they know, before going to sleep. The hours between the household settling for the night and the earliest moments of June 10th, 1912, are the hours the record cannot illuminate with any certainty. What is confirmed is the window, the household most likely asleep by 10:30 or 11 in the evening. The earliest estimates of the murders placed around midnight. The most probable window, suggested by the investigation, falling somewhere between 1 and 2 in the morning. Those hours were quiet. The street outside the house was empty. The town of Villisca was asleep in the way that a small Midwestern town sleeps in the early hours of a summer morning, without urgency, without awareness, the darkness ordinary and the quiet ordinary, and the houses on East 2nd Street indistinguishable from one another in the dark. The Moore home at 508 East 2nd Street was not, in the early morning hours of June 10, 1912, a house that distinguished itself from the houses around it in any visible way. Its exterior was that of a modest wood frame residence on a residential street in a small Iowa town. Its windows were dark. Its street was quiet. Inside it, 8 people were asleep, 2 adults who had spent their evening at a community event they had helped to organize, 6 children of whom the oldest was 11 and the youngest was an infant, and 2 young girls who had been invited to spend the night after an annual church program. The household was arranged in its nighttime configuration, and the street outside it was still, and the town around it was in the ordinary quiet of the hours between midnight and morning, when small towns do not stir. Josiah Moore had been building his business in Villisca for enough years by 1912 that it was an established part of the town's commercial life. The farm implement trade he was engaged in was not a marginal enterprise in an agricultural region. It was central to the economic life of the surrounding countryside, and a dealer who understood the business and had working relationships with the farmers of the area occupied a real position in the community's economic structure. Moore had that position. He had established it by departing from his employment and founding his own competing business, a decision that required confidence in his own knowledge of the trade and his relationships with the market he intended to serve. In June of 1912, he was 36 years old and the proprietor of a functioning dealership in a town where he and his family had a recognized place. Sarah Moore was 39. Her children ranged from 2 years to 11 years. The household she managed at 508 East 2nd Street was a full one, with the particular kind of organized daily life that a household containing 6 children requires, the rhythms of meals and school and church and community involvement, the layered demands of children at different ages and stages, the constant background activity of a family home that is genuinely inhabited. The evening of June 9th had been an evening of community participation of the kind that both reflected and sustained that family's place in Villisca's life. Sarah Moore had helped bring the Children's Day program together. Her children had stood before the congregation and performed. The Stillinger girls, daughters of a local farming family, had gone home with them afterward. Lena Stillinger was 12 years old. Her sister Ina was 8. They were the daughters of Joseph Stillinger, a local farmer, and they were members of the same community that the Moore family inhabited. The church, the school, the overlapping social world of a small town where families knew one another through the steady accumulation of shared occasions and daily proximity. The invitation to spend the night at the Moore home was, in that context, an entirely ordinary extension of an ordinary community evening. There is nothing in the record to suggest that either family viewed the arrangement as anything other than what it was, a practical and hospitable conclusion to a social evening, the kind of arrangement that families in small towns made without particular ceremony or record keeping. The downstairs guest room at 508 East 2nd Street was the room the Stillinger girls would have occupied. It was separate from the upstairs rooms where the Moore family slept, physically distinct from the main family bedrooms, a space reserved for visitors in the way that a family home of that period and that size maintained such spaces. Lena and Ina Stillinger, in that room, were guests of the family in the particular way that young girls spending the night in a friend's house are guests, part of the household for the night, accommodated in the space the household had for accommodating visitors, with whatever small domestic arrangements a summer overnight stay involved. The town of Villisca, in the early decades of the 20th century, was a community with the characteristics of its region and its time, a Midwestern agricultural town on the railroad, with the commercial and civic infrastructure that such towns developed, the churches and schools and businesses that gave a community of 2,500 people its particular shape. East 2nd Street was a residential street within that town, and the houses on it were the houses of families who had settled there in the ordinary way of families in settled communities, by work, by marriage, by the gradual accumulation of the domestic and social investments that constitute a life in a place. The Moore family at 508 was one household among others on that street, known to its neighbors in the casual and unexceptional way of neighbors in a small town. What the household at 508 East 2nd Street looked like on the outside in the earliest hours of June 10, 1912, was simply a house on a residential street, dark, quiet, its occupants asleep inside it, its exterior unremarkable in every particular. The wood-frame structure sat on its lot in the way that the other houses on the block sat on their lots. The street outside was empty. The town around it was still. The sky above Villisca in those early morning hours was the sky of a Midwestern summer night, and the air would have been warm in the way of June nights in southwestern Iowa. And there was nothing about the house at 508 East 2nd Street that set it apart from any other house on the block or any other residential block in any other small Iowa town in the dark hours before the day began. The Children's Day program at the Presbyterian Church had been by its nature an evening of community and ceremony, the kind of occasion that marks the year in the life of a congregation, that draws families together for a shared event organized around the participation of children, recitations, presentations, the assembled congregation, the familiar faces of neighbors and fellow church members, the ordinary occasion of a summer evening in the social calendar of a small town. Sarah Moore had been part of organizing it. The Moore children had stood before the congregation. The Stillinger girls had been present, and at the close of the evening, as the congregation dispersed and families made their way home through the June darkness, an informal arrangement had directed Lena and Ina Stillinger toward 508 East 2nd Street and the downstairs guest room of the Moore house, the most probable window for the household settling for the night, based on the known timeline of the evening's events, was 10:30 to 11 o'clock. A family of 6 children, returning home after a church program on a summer evening, would have settled into the nighttime routine of a busy household, the younger children to bed first, the older children following, the adults last. The infant Lena Gertrude, too young for the evening's events, would have been in whatever sleeping arrangement was customary for her. Boyd, at 2, would have been settled. The older children in the upstairs rooms would have been in their beds. Lena and Ina Stillinger, in the downstairs room, would have been asleep. Josiah and Sarah Moore, in their room, would have been asleep. By somewhere between 10:30 and 11 o'clock, the household at 508 East 2nd Street would have been quiet, the lights dark, the 8 people inside it at rest. The street outside the house was quiet in those hours. The neighboring houses were dark. The town of Villisca, in the early morning of June 10th, 1912, was in the settled quiet of a community asleep. No traffic on the streets, no activity visible on the residential blocks, the darkness uniform and undisturbed, the kind of stillness that descends on a small town in the hours when there is nothing to disturb it. The Moore home on East 2nd Street was part of that stillness. Its exterior gave no indication. In those hours, of anything other than a family at rest inside it, a household that had returned from a community evening and settled for the night in the ordinary way of families. The 6 more children occupied the upper rooms of the house. Herman, the oldest at 11, would have had his place in the household's sleeping arrangement. Mary Catherine at 10, Arthur at 7, Paul at 5, each one in the configuration of a family home that had organized its space around the practical requirements of 6 children at different stages. Boyd at 2, the infant Lena Gertrude, the youngest members of the household, in whatever arrangements the adults had made for them in the domestic geography of the house on East 2nd Street. And in the downstairs room, Lena Stillinger and Ina Stillinger, 12 and 8 years old, the daughters of a local farmer, guests for the night, after an evening at the Presbyterian Church. It is a particular quality of the documented record in cases like this one that the ordinary details of the days and evenings before an event accumulate a weight they did not carry at the time. The Children's Day program at the Presbyterian Church on the evening of June 9th, 1912, was an ordinary community event. The arrangement made between families at its close was an ordinary social arrangement. The walk or short journey to 508 East 2nd Street was an ordinary movement through a familiar town at the end of an ordinary evening. The household settling for the night was an ordinary household settling in the ordinary way. These are the documented facts of the evening of June 9th, 1912, and each of them was, at the moment of its occurrence, unremarkable, the kind of detail that would have registered as neither significant nor notable to anyone involved. Josiah Moore was 36. He had built a business in the town where his family lived. He had a wife and 6 children and a house on East 2nd Street. He had been at the church that evening, at the program his wife had helped to organize, watching his children perform before the congregation. Sarah Moore was 39, and the evening had been, in its documented outlines, a successful one, an event she had helped to bring together, a community gathering of the kind that sustained the social life of a small Iowa town, her children present and participating, the familiar faces of neighbors and fellow church members assembled in the church she attended. The Stillinger girls had come home with them, an informal overnight arrangement made at the evening's close, and by 10:30 or 11, the house would have been quiet. The town of Villisca, on the night of June 9th, into the morning of June 10th, 1912, was a town asleep. Its residential streets were empty. Its houses were dark. The particular ordinariness of a small Midwestern community in the summer darkness, the warm air, the quiet streets, the sound of nothing in particular, was, in those early morning hours, complete and undisturbed. The Moore home at 508 East 2nd Street was indistinguishable from the houses around it. 8 people were asleep inside it. The street was quiet. The night was ordinary in every external respect. The house dark in the way that houses are dark when the people inside them have gone to rest. The block undisturbed. The town around it still. Investigators later worked from the confirmed details of the evening's timeline to establish when the household most probably settled. The end of the church program, the journey home, the routine of putting children to bed, the ordinary progression of a family night. 10:30 to 11 o'clock was the window the record supported. The murders were believed to have occurred between midnight and 5 in the morning of June 10th, with the most probable estimate placing the window around 1 to 2 o'clock in the morning. Those hours, the hours between the household settling and the first light of dawn, are hours the record cannot populate with anything certain. What the documentation confirms is simply the state of the house at their beginning. 8 people asleep, the lights dark, the street outside quiet, the house at 508 East 2nd Street sitting on its residential block in a small Iowa town, ordinary and still in the early morning of June 10th, 1912, indistinguishable from any other house on the block or from any other night in the quiet, settled life of a family that had, by all documented accounts, simply gone home from church and gone to sleep. The axe was found leaning against the wall of the downstairs bedroom. It was a 2-pound tool, the kind kept in a barn or shed for ordinary use around a working household. Neither large nor remarkable, a piece of everyday equipment belonging to Josiah Moore, recovered exactly where it had been left, in the corner of the room where the Stillinger girls had been sleeping. Investigators documented its position when they entered the house on the morning of June 10th, 1912. It had not been taken. It had not been hidden. It rested against the wall in the quiet of a room the morning light was reaching slowly, and the people who found it noted its location in the record they were beginning to build. The house at 508 East 2nd Street was discovered under circumstances that were initially ambiguous. A neighbor, Mary Peckham, had noticed that the Moore home was unusually still on the morning of June 10th. No activity, no children, no ordinary signs of a household beginning its day. She knocked. There was no answer. She tried the door and found it locked. What she could see through the windows was not immediately conclusive, and the stillness of the house could have been explained by any number of ordinary things. The decision to contact Josiah Moore's brother, Ross Moore, was made because the quiet had gone on long enough to press against what was normal, and when Ross Moore arrived and opened the house, what the interior held became immediately clear. By the time the first accounts of the morning were being written into the investigative record, the confirmed fact was this: 8 people had been found in their beds, each one covered by their bedclothes, each one dead. The arrangement of the house had a particular quality that investigators noted early. All 8 victims were in their beds, as they had been when they went to sleep. The bedclothes had been drawn over each of them, not disturbed in the way one might expect from a scene of sustained violence, but placed, the word investigators and later researchers tended to use was covered, because the covering appeared to have been done after the attacks, a deliberate act of arrangement rather than the ordinary result of someone sleeping quietly through the night. The Moore family was distributed across the upstairs bedrooms, Josiah and Sarah Moore in one room, Herman, Mary Catherine, Arthur, and Paul in another, Boyd and the infant Lena Gertrude in a third. The Stillinger girls, Lena and Ina, were in the downstairs guest bedroom. The axe was found in that room. Each of the 8 had been struck in the head multiple times with the blunt pole end of the axe, the flat back surface of the head of the tool, not the blade. It was the pole that early medical examination and coroner findings identified as the instrument of the injuries, the blunt end rather than the sharp one. This distinction was recorded carefully in the evidentiary findings from the beginning, and it remained a consistent and documented fact of the case. The choice of the pole rather than the blade was noted. Its implications for the manner of the attacks registered in the medical record. The nature of the injuries described at the level of what the examination found, rather than what it looked like. What the coroner's findings indicated was that no significant struggle appeared to have taken place in any of the rooms where the victims were found. The evidence was consistent with each person having been attacked while asleep. The injuries sustained without an interval of waking and resistance that would have left its own traces in the scene. The beds, the positions of the bodies, the arrangement of the bedclothes, all of it held together in a way that was consistent with 8 people who had not woken before the end. The medical record noted the nature of the injuries as consistent with a sustained and repeated attack rather than a single blow. This finding was documented separately for multiple victims, and the examination findings taken together indicated that whoever had moved through the house that night had spent a measurable amount of time in each room. The attacks were not momentary. The record that the physical evidence produced was of something that had taken time, not rushed, not hurried away from, but carried out room by room through a house where the only sounds would have been the ordinary settling of a frame structure in the hours before dawn, and whatever sounds the attacker themselves made, moving through the dark. What investigators found as they moved through the house on the morning of June 10th extended well beyond the position of the axe and the condition of the victims. The mirrors in the house had been covered. Clothing had been draped across the glass. Not one mirror, but the mirrors in multiple rooms, each one obscured by a separate, deliberate act. This detail was recorded in the investigative notes from the earliest examination of the house, and it was a detail that required a specific accounting. Whoever had covered the mirrors had moved through the house after the attacks were complete, locating each reflective surface, taking something from the nearby environment, a piece of clothing, a cloth, and placing it across the glass. The act of covering a mirror is not accidental. It requires intention, and it requires time, and the presence of covered mirrors in multiple rooms documented the fact that the person who had committed the murders had not left immediately after the last victim was struck. The lamp chimneys had also been covered or draped. The lamps in the rooms of the house, their glass chimneys obscured by cloth or clothing placed over them, stood in their altered state when investigators entered the house and began to record what they found. A lamp chimney in a home of the period was the glass cylinder that enclosed and protected the flame of an oil lamp, tall and clear, designed to allow light to pass through while shielding the flame. To cover one was to reduce or eliminate the light it would cast, and to cover several of them across multiple rooms was another sequence of deliberate, unhurried acts performed in a house where 8 people had just been killed. The documentation of the covered lamp chimneys sits alongside the documentation of the covered mirrors in the evidentiary record, 2 separate categories of deliberate post-attack behavior, each one requiring the killer to move through the house with attention to specific objects in specific locations, taking the time to address each one in turn. The meaning investigators and later researchers assigned to these acts was not established as certain in the record. Various interpretations were offered, and they are noted in the documented history of the case as theories rather than conclusions. What remained confirmed and not subject to significant dispute was the physical fact itself. The mirrors were covered, the lamp chimneys were covered, and both sets of coverings had been placed by whoever was inside the house during and after the attacks. The investigative record holds these as documented facts of the scene, what they signified about the person who placed them, what the act of covering a mirror or obscuring a lamp meant to whoever performed it. Those questions remained open in the record as it was assembled, and they remained open in the record as it accumulated in the years that followed. The time the killer had spent inside the Moore home was one of the central questions the physical evidence raised, and it was a question the evidence addressed imperfectly. The covered mirrors and covered lamp chimneys documented the presence of a person moving through the house after the attacks, a period of time of deliberate activity inside a locked house on a quiet residential street in a small Iowa town in the early hours of June 10th, 1912. The locked doors were their own part of the record. When Ross Moore opened the house that morning, the investigators who subsequently arrived found the doors locked from the inside or secured in ways consistent with the house having been sealed from within. The precise mechanism of entry and exit was a question that received investigative attention without arriving at a fully documented and confirmed answer, but the locked condition of the house was noted in the early record and remained a consistent detail of the evidentiary picture. The axe itself received careful documentation. 2 pounds, a household tool, its origin in the Moore barn or shed, recorded in the investigative notes. Its presence inside the house, having been carried in by whoever entered, or having been taken from its usual storage place outside and brought through a door that someone had opened, was a documented fact of the scene. The Moore family's ownership of the tool was established early and not contested. The question of how it came to be inside the house, who had carried it in, and by what route, was part of the investigative record without arriving at a settled answer. What the record held plainly was the tool itself, its weight, its condition, and the wall of the downstairs bedroom where it rested when investigators first saw it. The gouge marks in the ceilings of the upstairs bedrooms were among the most precisely informative physical evidence the house contained. Investigators found them in the rooms where the victims had been killed, marks in the plaster of the ceiling made by the backswing of the axe as it was raised for a strike. The geometry of those marks was not incidental. Each gouge was at a specific height and at a specific angle, and the position and trajectory of each mark gave investigators information about where in the room the person making the mark had been standing and at what angle the axe had been swung. This kind of physical evidence, passive, preserved in the structure of the house itself, requiring no witness to report it and no testimony to establish its existence, was documented in the investigative record and examined by investigators attempting to reconstruct the sequence of events in each room. The ceiling marks in the upstairs bedrooms were of particular value because they placed the attacker spatially. They indicated where in each room the attacks had been carried out, and they allowed investigators to reason with some documented basis about the physical mechanics of what had happened in those rooms. A gouge in plaster at a specific height and angle is a fixed record. It does not move. It does not change its account over time. It does not introduce the complications that witness testimony introduces. It remains in the wall where the swing of the axe placed it, holding whatever information its position encodes. Investigators in 1912 examined those marks and drew what conclusions they could. Later researchers examining the case returned to those same documented measurements. The marks were there in the ceilings of the Moore home long after the first investigators had left the house and long after the first round of examinations had been completed. The downstairs bedroom where the Stillinger girls had slept received particular forensic attention because it was the room where the axe had been left. The investigators who documented that room recorded both the position of the axe, leaning against the wall, and the condition of the room's occupants and their surroundings. The guest bedroom where Lena and Ina Stillinger had been placed for the night was in the sequence of rooms through the house, separated from the upstairs bedrooms where the Moore family slept. The killer, whatever route had been taken through the house, had addressed both the upstairs rooms and the downstairs room. The axe had been left in the room where the Stillinger girls had been killed, rather than returned to wherever it had come from or carried out of the house. It rested where it was left, and the investigators who found it recorded it there. The physical detail of the covered mirrors carries a particular weight in the documented history of the case, not because of what it certainly means, but because of how thoroughly it was documented and how consistently it appears across the investigative record from its earliest entries. The first accounts of the house's interior included the covered mirrors. Subsequent examinations confirmed them. They appear in the notes of investigators who entered the house on the morning of June 10th and in the accounts of those who examined the house in the days and weeks that followed. Multiple investigators, entering independently and examining the scene with different questions in mind, recorded the same covered mirrors in the same rooms. The convergence of independent accounts around the same physical detail gave it a solidity in the record that some other elements of the case did not achieve. The same is true of the covered lamp chimneys. Multiple independent accounts from early in the investigation confirm their presence, their placement, and the fact that the covering appeared deliberate rather than accidental. Lamp chimneys do not cover themselves. A cloth placed across a glass cylinder, fitted there carefully enough to remain in position through the dark hours of an Iowa summer night, had been placed by a hand, and the person whose hand had placed it had been moving through the Moore home after the attacks were complete, attending to the lamps in the rooms with the same deliberate focus that had been applied to the mirrors. The combination of these two categories of covered objects, mirrors and lamp chimneys, in multiple rooms, each requiring a separate, intentional act, documented a period of post-attack activity inside the house that investigators recognized as significant from the beginning of their examination. The reconstruction that investigators attempted, using the ceiling gouge marks, the position of the axe, and the documented layout of the house, was a partial one. The contamination of the crime scene in the hours after its discovery placed real limits on what could be known with confidence from the physical evidence alone, and the investigators who attempted to reason from the scene were working with material that had already been compromised by the time systematic forensic examination began. The ceiling marks were among the most durable pieces of evidence because they were embedded in the structure of the house itself, not an object that could be moved or mishandled, but an impression in plaster that held its information regardless of what happened to the movable contents of the rooms below. Investigators noted the marks. They measured them. They used them to reason about positioning and sequence. The documented findings from this examination formed one of the more stable parts of the evidentiary record, precisely because the evidence itself could not be taken away. The axe's ordinary character as a household tool was a consistent detail of its documentation. It was not brought from outside the Moore property, or so the investigative record held, based on its identification as belonging to the household and its ordinary storage in the barn or shed. A tool kept outside, brought in through a door someone had opened, used inside the house, and left in the downstairs bedroom when whoever had used it departed. Whether the axe had been retrieved from the barn specifically for the purpose of the attack, or whether it had been brought inside for some other reason, prior to the night of June 9th, was not established in the documentary record with clarity. What was confirmed was its ownership, its usual location outside the house, its presence inside the house after the murders, and its specific resting place against the wall of the room where the Stillinger girls had slept. The absence of evidence of significant struggle across all 8 rooms was a finding that early investigators registered and that subsequent examinations of the record have noted consistently. In a house with 8 occupants, 2 of them adults and the eldest child, 11 years old, the absence of any documented sign of sustained physical resistance in any of the rooms was a finding with implications for the sequence and character of the attacks. The medical examination findings supported the interpretation that the victims had been asleep and had not woken before the attacks were complete, though this conclusion, like most conclusions drawn from physical evidence in a case whose scene was compromised, was held in the record as a supported inference rather than a certain fact. The beds, the positions, the covered victims, all of it was consistent with sleep, and the documented absence of the physical traces that struggle leaves behind supported the medical findings in the same direction. The house on East 2nd Street in Villisca, Iowa, in the morning light of June 10, 1912, presented a particular problem for the investigators who arrived to examine it. The exterior gave nothing away. The interior, once the doors were opened, was outwardly arranged in a way that had initially caused Mary Peckham to hesitate. The house quiet, its occupants apparently sleeping, the ordinary shape of a household at rest. What the interior actually held, under that surface of arrangement, was something the physical evidence documented carefully and the investigative record preserved: the covered mirrors, the covered lamp chimneys, the axe against the wall, the gouge marks in the plaster above the upstairs beds, the 8 covered figures in their rooms, each one still, each one struck, each one left in place by a person who had moved through the house with deliberate attention to specific acts and objects. The lamp chimneys in particular, their covering documented, their positions in the rooms recorded, represent a category of evidence that places the killer inside the house for a period of time that was not brief. The distance between the completion of the last attack and the departure from the house wherever it occurred was filled by movement through the rooms, by the locating of cloth or clothing, by the placement of coverings across glass surfaces in multiple locations. The act of covering a lamp chimney requires finding something to cover it with, approaching the lamp, and placing the cloth carefully enough to obscure the glass. In multiple rooms, in the dark, or in whatever light was available after the lamp's own chimney had been covered. In a house where 8 people had just been killed, and where the street outside was quiet and dark, and the town of Villisca was asleep on the early morning of June 10th, 1912. There is a quality to the documented detail of the covered mirrors and the covered lamp chimneys that sets it apart from the other physical evidence in its specificity and its persistence. The gouge marks in the ceiling spoke to the mechanics of the attacks. The condition of the victims and the medical findings spoke to the manner of death. The position of the axe spoke to a specific physical object left in a specific location by a specific person who had then departed. But the covered mirrors and lamp chimneys spoke to something different, to a period of deliberate, focused activity inside the house that had nothing to do with the attacks themselves, carried out by someone who moved through the rooms of a sleeping family's home with enough composure to attend to glass surfaces and oil lamp chimneys after everything else was done. The investigators who recorded these details on the morning of June 10th noted them plainly. They appear in the earliest accounts of the scene, and they remained in the record as it accumulated across the months and years that followed. The investigative conclusions about the sequence of rooms were partial and contested. The ceiling marks provided the most stable spatial information. A gouge at a specific height in a specific room told investigators something reliable about where the person making it had stood. But the full sequence through the house, the order in which the rooms had been entered and addressed, the route from door to door through the upstairs and down to the ground floor where the Stillinger girls had slept, these were reconstructed from evidence that was already compromised by the time systematic examination began, and the reconstruction was held in the record as a working account rather than a confirmed certainty. What was not contested was the final position of the axe in the downstairs bedroom, against the wall, left there by whoever had carried it through the house and used it across multiple rooms and then set it down, or leaned it there, and done what they did next, which was to cover the mirrors, cover the lamp chimneys, and eventually leave through a door that was found locked behind them. The physical record of the Moore home on the morning of June 10th, 1912, was assembled from evidence that began to be collected under difficult conditions and continued to be examined across several years and multiple investigative efforts. The sealing marks remained. The documented positions of the covered objects remained in the written record, even when the objects themselves were moved. The axe was recovered and preserved as evidence. The medical and coroner findings were committed to paper in the days following the discovery and held in the archival record. What the physical evidence showed, taken together, was a scene of considerable deliberateness, not the physical evidence of a panic departure, not the chaos that might accompany an attack by someone operating without composure, but a scene whose documented details were consistent with someone who had spent a significant period inside the house, who had attended to specific objects in specific rooms, and who had left the household in a state of apparent surface quiet that was only understood for what it was when someone entered and saw what the bedclothes were covering. The axe resting against the wall of the downstairs bedroom holds its place in the record with a particularity that the other physical evidence can share, but not quite replicate. It was Josiah Moore's own tool. It had been kept outside, in the barn or shed of a family home on a residential street in a small Iowa town. It had been carried inside the house, used across multiple rooms over a period of time that the evidence suggested was not short, and left in the room where the youngest victims, the Stillinger girls, guests for the night after a Children's Day church program, had been sleeping when whoever carried the axe entered their room. It was found leaning there, recovered by investigators who noted its weight and its origin and its position, and entered into the record of a case that would remain open through the trials that followed, through the decades that accumulated after those trials, and through the long stillness in which the case continued to be held long after the house that contained its evidence had been examined and re-examined and finally left to stand on its street with whatever it still held in its walls and ceilings. The gouge marks in the plaster of the upstairs bedrooms remained there after the first investigators left. They remained through the examination of the house in the days and weeks following the discovery, through the subsequent investigations that returned to the scene, through the legal proceedings of 1916 and 1917 that brought the case into courtrooms without bringing it to a conclusion. Physical impressions in plaster do not degrade the way other forms of evidence degrade. They do not require testimony to confirm them. They do not depend on the reliability of a witness who was present. They were made at a specific angle by a specific swing of a specific 2-pound tool in specific rooms where specific people slept on the night of June 9th and the early hours of June 10th, 1912. Investigators measured them and recorded what they found. The measurements went into the file. The file accumulated. The marks stayed in the ceilings of the rooms where they had been made, holding the angle and the arc of the axe exactly as they always had, a fixed record, set into the structure of the house, patient in the way that physical things embedded in walls and ceilings are patient, outlasting the investigation that first documented them, and every investigation that returned to them afterward. On the morning of June 10th, 1912, before any trained investigator had walked the rooms of the Moore home with a systematic eye, the house was already filling with people. Local residents arrived. Officials came without forensic preparation. Curiosity brought others to the door, and the door was not held against them. In the hours between the discovery of the bodies and the arrival of anyone capable of conducting an orderly examination of the scene, the house at 508 East 2nd Street was moved through by a succession of people whose presence in its rooms, however well-intentioned, was already undoing the coherence of the evidentiary record that any subsequent investigation would need. Objects were handled, surfaces were touched, the arrangement of the house as the killer had left it, the particular position of each item, the specific condition of each room, began to shift away from what it had been in the night, carried piece by piece into a state from which it could not be recovered. This was the first and most consequential failure of the Villisca inquiry, and it preceded every suspect, every detective, every theory that followed. What it meant in practical terms was that any investigation of the murders would begin already compromised. The physical record of the crime, the one form of evidence that could not be generated again, the one account that could not be corrected by further interviews or additional documentation, was degraded before it was ever fully read. The inquiry that followed was conducted in the shadow of that morning, shaped by it, in ways that investigators at every stage of the case would have occasion to recognize. The investigation did not begin as a unified effort. In the days and weeks after the murders, the question of who bore responsibility for finding the killer was not cleanly assigned to a single agency or investigator. The local sheriff's office was involved, as were county authorities, and the state of Iowa would eventually take an interest in the proceedings. But the involvement of official agencies was complicated almost immediately by the entry of private parties who hired their own investigators and pursued their own theories with their own resources and their own motivations. The result was not a single investigation with a coherent structure. It was a set of parallel investigations, each proceeding from its own premises, each oriented toward conclusions that served particular interests, and each inclined to treat the findings of the others as competition rather than as contribution. This structure, if it can be called a structure at all, held from the beginning and did not substantially change. Among the first figures to emerge as a person of documented interest was Frank Fernando Jones. Jones was a wealthy man by the standards of southwestern Iowa in 1912. He had served in the Iowa State Legislature, where he held a seat as a state senator, and he was known in the region as a figure of some financial standing and political presence. He had also been, for a period, Josiah Moore's employer. The specific nature of the relationship between Jones and Moore, as it was documented in the investigative record, turned on the question of business. Moore had worked as a sales agent for a firm connected to Jones, an implement dealership with a regional footprint that relied on agents like Moore to conduct its operations across southwestern Iowa. At some point prior to 1912, Moore departed that arrangement and established his own competing implement dealership in Villisca. The business he built drew from the same customer base, operated in the same market, and offered the same class of agricultural equipment that Jones's enterprise had previously supplied, without competition from Moore. Whether Jones understood Moore's departure as a betrayal, or whether the two men's relationship had soured before or after the establishment of the competing business, was not something the record resolved with certainty. What it documented was the rivalry, the history, and the fact that Jones emerged early as a figure investigators examined with particular attention. The theory that attached to Jones was not one of personal violence. No investigator who put Jones's name in the record suggested that Jones had himself traveled to 508 East 2nd Street on the night of June 9th and killed the Moore family. The theory, as it developed and was formally pursued, was different in character. It held that Jones had the motive to want Josiah Moore dead, the financial resources to make an arrangement of the kind that motive can lead a person toward, and the connections to reach a man capable of carrying out what Jones could not or would not do himself. This was the framework within which Jones was investigated, and it remained a framework built entirely on circumstantial material, No document in the investigative record established that Jones had hired anyone. No transaction was confirmed. No communication between Jones and any potential hired party was produced. What the record contained was the documented history of the business relationship, the rivalry it had generated, and the investigative interest that history attracted in the weeks and months after the murders. Jones maintained his innocence throughout the period of inquiry into his activities, and the investigation into his possible involvement produced no legal action against him. The name that the Jones theory eventually produced was William Mansfield. Mansfield was identified by a private investigator named James Newton Wilkerson as a man who could have served as the operative in an arrangement of the kind Jones was suspected of having made. Wilkerson was not working for the state of Iowa or for any official law enforcement agency. He had been hired by a private party whose interests were aligned with the Jones theory, and he pursued it with considerable energy over an extended period. His work on the case constituted a substantial body of documented investigation, interviews, travel, correspondence, the accumulation of material about Mansfield's movements and history, and it formed the evidentiary foundation on which the Jones-Mansfield theory rested. What Wilkerson found, or what he documented as his findings, was a set of circumstantial connections between Mansfield and a series of axe murders that had occurred in Kansas and in other Midwestern states in the years surrounding the Villisca killings. Families killed in their homes, in their beds, with blunt instruments, in the hours between midnight and dawn. The same general pattern of attack, documented in locations spread across the region, in a window of years that overlapped with June 10, 1912. The argument Wilkerson advanced was that Mansfield was a man capable of this kind of work, that his movements placed him in proximity to multiple sites of similar crimes, and that the connection to Jones provided the motive that would have brought him to Villisca specifically. The case against Mansfield was entirely circumstantial. No physical evidence connected him to the Moore home. No document placed him in Villisca on the night of June 9th. The pattern Wilkerson identified across multiple crime scenes was real in the sense that the crimes themselves were real and documented, but the interpretation of that pattern as the work of a single individual, and specifically of Mansfield, was a theory, a framework that the circumstantial evidence was consistent with but did not confirm. Investigators working from different premises reached different conclusions. The official apparatus of the inquiry, such as it was, did not adopt the Jones-Mansfield theory as its primary direction. Wilkerson's work existed in parallel with, and at times in direct conflict with, the investigations being conducted by other agencies and other hired detectives. The second major figure who emerged from the investigation was of a very different character. Reverend George Jacklin Kelly was an itinerant minister, a man who moved through the small towns and church communities of the rural Midwest, conducting services and programs and remaining in any one place only briefly before moving on. On the evening of June 9th, 1912, Kelly was in Villisca. He attended the Children's Day program at the Presbyterian Church, the same gathering where the Moore family spent their last documented hours as a household moving through an ordinary evening. He was present in the building, among the families, during the program that concluded and sent the town home to bed. On the morning of June 10th, Kelly was not in Villisca. He had boarded an early train, the specific departure recorded in the investigative record, and left the town on the morning the bodies were found. The departure was confirmed. It was documented. It was not disputed. Whether it reflected the ordinary movement of a traveling minister completing a brief engagement and moving on to the next stop on his circuit, or whether it reflected something else was a question the investigation would spend years trying to answer. The statements Kelly made about the murders in the period after his departure from Villisca drew investigative attention for a specific reason. What he said, in correspondence, in conversation, in accounts that reached investigators through various channels, was characterized by investigators as containing detail that a person with no knowledge of the crime's particulars would not have been expected to possess. The precise nature of this detail and the question of how Kelly might have come to know it became one of the central threads of inquiry into his possible involvement. Whether his knowledge reflected guilt, proximity, rumor, or the ordinary circulation of information through church and community networks in 1912 was a question the record posed without resolving. What the investigation of Kelly produced, after years of effort, was a confession, a statement attributed to Kelly, in which he allegedly admitted to the killings. This confession became the primary evidentiary tool with which prosecutors eventually moved against him. It also became, almost immediately, a contested document. Kelly denied having made the confession in the terms it was presented. He contested its authenticity, challenged the circumstances of its production, and maintained that it did not accurately represent what he had said. The dispute over the confession, what it contained, how it had been obtained, whether it was reliable, would follow the case into court and remain there, unresolved through both legal proceedings that followed. The investigation of Kelly ran in direct and documented conflict with Wilkerson's investigation into Jones and Mansfield. These were not complementary inquiries that different teams were pursuing in a coordinated effort to exhaust all leads. They were competing theories, each being pursued by investigators working on behalf of parties with different interests and different desired outcomes. The investigation into Kelly's possible guilt and the investigation into Jones's possible role as the architect of a hired killing operated in the same evidentiary space, working from the same set of underlying facts about what had happened on the night of June 9th, and arriving at conclusions that could not both be correct. The effect of this competition on the investigation as a whole was substantial. Documents and findings that one set of investigators produced were not freely shared with or built upon by the other. Lines of inquiry that one agency pursued were regarded by the other with suspicion, and sometimes with active opposition. The information environment of the Villisca investigation in the years after the murders was not one in which facts accumulated in a single place toward a single picture. It was one in which facts, such as they were, accumulated in separate files in service of separate arguments, and the overall record that resulted was something closer to an archive of competing narratives than to the unified evidentiary base a coherent prosecution would have required. Jones, for his part, did not remain a passive figure in this environment. The documentary record indicates that he was involved in funding investigative work of his own, work-oriented, it appears, at least in part toward directing suspicion toward Kelly and away from himself. Really, the question of whether this reflected the behavior of a man with something to hide or the behavior of a man with financial resources and an interest in protecting his reputation from what he regarded as unfair suspicion, is one the record raises without answering. Both explanations are consistent with what is documented. Neither is established as the correct one. The private investigative work that accumulated over the years following the murders was considerable in volume and complicated in character. Wilkerson produced a substantial body of material. Forsaker debated their own findings. Official investigations generated reports. The file of the Villisca axe murders, as it accumulated, became a large and internally contradictory document, a record of sustained investigative effort that by the nature of its organization could not cohere into the kind of unified account that might have supported a clear legal conclusion. The contamination of the crime scene in the hours after discovery was not a single catastrophic act. It was the aggregate result of many individual movements through the house, each one small, many of them well-intentioned, most of them driven by nothing more complicated than the shock and curiosity of a small community confronting the worst thing that had happened within its borders in living memory. The neighbors who entered the house were not acting in bad faith. The officials who moved through the rooms without establishing a formal protocol were not malicious. The loss of evidentiary integrity that resulted from their presence was nonetheless real, and its consequences were permanent. Evidence that might have narrowed the field of suspects, that might have placed a specific person in a specific room at a specific time, that might have resolved the conflict between competing theories. That evidence, if it ever existed in the house, was distributed and degraded before anyone with the training to recognize its value had the opportunity to preserve it. What investigators were left with, in the absence of a clean crime scene, was a set of facts that were consistent with more than one explanation. The 2-pound axe that had been found in the downstairs bedroom, Josiah Moore's own property, recovered inside the house, established how the killings had been carried out. The covered mirrors, the covered lamp chimneys, the particular way in which the house had been moved through after the household went quiet. These facts established something about the kind of person who had done this, the degree of deliberateness involved, the time spent inside the house after the violence had ended. But they did not name anyone. They did not produce an identity. They were consistent with the hypothesis of a hired professional who had been sent to a specific house for a specific purpose. They were also consistent with the hypothesis of a traveling figure who had encountered an opportunity and acted on it. The evidence did not discriminate between these frameworks in any way that could be resolved through the investigative record available. The years passed and the inquiry did not close so much as it spread. New investigators took up threads that earlier ones had dropped. Old findings were re-examined by people who had not been part of the original effort and who brought fresh eyes to material that had been sitting in files for months or years. The Jones-Mansfield theory expanded through Wilkerson's continued work, acquiring additional circumstantial support through the comparison of the Villisca case with other Midwestern axe murders, and through the documentation of Mansfield's movements and history in the years surrounding 1912. The Kelly investigation deepened through the accumulation of statements, accounts, and the eventually contested confession, reaching a point where prosecutors believed they had sufficient material to bring charges. None of this convergence produced certainty. The competing threads of investigation did not resolve into a single account. The circumstantial case against Mansfield remained circumstantial. The evidentiary case against Kelly rested on a confession whose reliability was disputed, and on no physical evidence that placed him in the Moore home. The documented rivalry between Jones and Moore remained exactly what it had always been, a confirmed fact about their business relationship that investigators had interpreted through the lens of the theory they were pursuing as evidence of motive. At no point in the documented history of the investigation did any investigative body, official or private, produce evidence that established beyond reasonable doubt who had entered the Moore home on the night of June 9th, 1912. The competing inquiries, each generating its own findings in service of its own preferred conclusions, had collectively produced a file of considerable size and very limited clarity. The original crime scene, degraded in the hours after discovery, could not be reconstituted. The chain of events that had begun with the entry of local residents and officials into the house on the morning of June 10th had produced a consequence that no subsequent investigation could reverse. The structural conditions of the inquiry, the competing private detective agencies, the fractured ownership of the case, the absence of a single coordinating authority with the power to impose order on the collection and preservation of evidence were not anomalies. They were features of how this kind of investigation worked in 1912 in a rural county in Iowa without the institutional apparatus that a later era would bring to the investigation of serious crime. What happened to the Villisca investigation was not uniquely the result of bad actors or deliberate obstruction, though the competition between investigators may have had elements of both. It was also, and perhaps primarily, the result of a system encountering a problem it was not well equipped to solve. A murder of 8 people, a crime scene already compromised, a set of suspects whose connections to the crime were indirect and circumstantial, and no single institutional authority with the resources, the mandate, and the evidentiary footing to pursue a single coherent line of investigation to its conclusion. The investigators who worked the case in those years, official and private, competing and occasionally overlapping, were documenting what they found and following what they believed. Wilkerson's work on the Jones-Mansfield theory reflected a genuine conviction built from years of inquiry that a hired killer had been responsible, and that the key to identifying him lay in comparing the Villisca case to similar crimes across the region. The investigators who pursued Kelly were following evidence that they found credible and significant, and the statements they documented and the confession they produced were, in their understanding, sufficient to support a prosecution. Both sets of investigators were working from an evidentiary record that had been compromised before any of them arrived, and both were drawing conclusions that the available material could support in theory without being able to confirm in fact. Frank Jones would not face criminal charges for the Villisca murders. The theory of his involvement, as Wilkerson developed and documented it, remained a theory. The documented business rivalry, the confirmed departure of Moore from Jones's employ, the competing dealership, and the grievance that history was said to have produced, all of this remained in the file as background, as context, as the circumstantial architecture of a motive that investigators had identified and pursued without being able to establish in the legal terms a prosecution requires. Jones died with the matter unresolved against him, the documented suspicion remaining in the record but never translated into a charge. Mansfield similarly avoided prosecution. The circumstantial connections that Wilkerson had documented between him and multiple axe murders in Kansas and the surrounding states, the geographic proximity, the behavioral patterns he claimed to identify across crime scenes, the theory of a man who moved through the rural Midwest committing killings for hire, were documented in Wilkerson's files, but did not produce the legal case that would have been necessary to bring Mansfield before a court. Whether the evidence was insufficient, whether the institutional will to pursue it was lacking, or whether the competitive and fractured nature of the broader investigation prevented the Jones-Mansfield theory from being advanced through official channels with the force it might have needed. The outcome was the same. Mansfield was named, documented, investigated, and not charged. Kelly's path through the investigation was different. The documented confession, the departure from Villisca on the morning the bodies were found, the statements that investigators characterized as suspiciously detailed, these formed the basis of a prosecution that other suspects in the case were never subjected to. Kelly would be arrested and charged, and the disputed confession would be carried into a courtroom where its reliability would be tested before a jury. That process, the specific legal reckoning that the investigation had generated, would constitute its own chapter in the history of the case, distinct from the investigation that had produced it, and governed by the different standards and structures of a formal legal proceeding. What remained in the investigation's wake, before that legal chapter opened, was the file. Multiple agencies had contributed to it. Multiple theories had shaped it. The original crime scene documentation, such as it was, sat alongside years of subsequent investigative material, interviews, statements, correspondence, the documented findings of competing detectives, the records of what had been pursued and what had been set aside. The file was large. It was internally contradictory in the ways that a file produced by competing investigations conducted under adverse conditions inevitably becomes. It held the record of everything investigators had believed, and everything they had followed, and everything they had not been able to confirm, accumulated over years, organized around a crime scene that had been compromised on the morning it was discovered. The case that had begun in the early hours of June 10, 1912, had moved through the subsequent years in the shape that the morning of its discovery had given it. Fractured, competitive, built on a foundation that the first hours of foot traffic through the Moore home had already begun to erode. The investigators who worked it had done so with the tools and the institutional structure available to them, and the record they produced was the record those conditions made possible. Detailed in places, incomplete in others, certain about very little, and divided against itself from the first days of the inquiry to the last. The competing files, Jones, Mansfield, Kelly, sat in their separate accumulations, each one a documented argument for a different answer to the same question, none of them finding the ground it needed to become the single answer the case required. The investigation's files, stacked against one another in the documentary record, had arrived by the time of Kelly's arrest at something that looked, from a distance, like a body of evidence, but which, on examination, was something more complicated than that. What it was, more precisely, was a body of competing conclusions, each one reached from different starting premises, each one supported by material its authors had found credible, and none of them standing alone in a way that the legal process that followed would be able to resolve. The file was substantial. The file was, in its own way, thorough, and the file, in the most important sense, was divided against itself in ways that the inquiry had never found a way to repair. That was the shape of the Villisca investigation as it stood at the close of its primary period of activity. Multiple private detectives, multiple theories, multiple suspected parties, a crime scene lost to the morning of June 10th, and a documentary record that had grown steadily without converging on the single, clear, legally sustainable answer that 8 deaths on a quiet street in a small Iowa town had, from the beginning, demanded. George Kelly was arrested in 1916. More than 4 years had passed since the morning of June 10th, 1912, when the bodies were found in the Moore home on East 2nd Street, and the formal charge that was laid against him in that 4th year represented the first time the legal system had moved from investigation to prosecution. The gap between the killings and the arrest was not a minor procedural detail. It was a span of 4 years during which the evidentiary record had degraded, witnesses had moved on, and the original physical conditions of the crime scene had long since been disturbed beyond recovery. The case that prosecutors would bring to trial had been built under those conditions, on material gathered in the years after the fact, and the trials that followed would be shaped at every point by the weight of what had already been lost. The charge itself rested substantially on statements Kelly had made in the period following the murders, and on a confession he had allegedly given to investigators during the course of the inquiry. Kelly disputed the confession. his positions maintained consistently through the years between the murders and the arrest, and carried into the courtroom when the trials began, was that the confession attributed to him was not reliable, that what he had said had been misrepresented or extracted under conditions that rendered it invalid as evidence of guilt. The prosecution held a different account of the same events. What the jury would be asked to do in the first trial was to weigh those two accounts against each other in the absence of physical evidence that could independently corroborate either one. The first trial proceeded in 1916. The courtroom was in Iowa, a formal legal setting in the ordinary way of such places. A judge, a jury, opposing counsel, the procedural structures through which the law moves toward a finding. The distance in time from the original crime was visible in the materials that both sides brought to the proceedings. The crime scene itself was 4 years gone, its physical record interrupted in the first hours of discovery and never fully restored. The axe had been recovered. The gouge marks in the ceilings had been documented, but the careful, systematic reconstruction of what had happened inside that house on the night of June 9th to 10, 1912, had never been achievable in the way that a clean scene and a coordinated inquiry might have made it achievable. And by 1916, it was considerably further from reach than it had been in the days and weeks after the discovery. What the prosecution had was the confession. What the defense had was the challenge to that confession. These were the two primary objects around which the first trial turned, and the jury's task was to determine, from the materials placed before them, whether the confession could be trusted, whether it represented Kelly's actual account of his own actions, or whether its production and its contents were sufficiently compromised to prevent it from standing as proof of guilt. The jury was unable to agree. The first trial ended in a hung jury, with the 12 people who had heard the evidence dividing, without reaching a unanimous verdict in either direction. A hung jury is a specific legal outcome, not a finding of innocence, not a finding of guilt, but a documented failure to reach agreement. In the context of the Kelly prosecution, it reflected something that the case file had been indicating for years. The evidentiary foundation beneath any attempt to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt was narrow. The confession was the weight-bearing element of the prosecution's case, and the confession was contested. Without independent corroboration, physical evidence placing Kelly at the scene, witnesses who could testify directly to his movements on the night of June 9th to 10, forensic findings that connected him specifically to the victims or the weapon, the contested confession was asked to carry a burden that a divided jury found it could not support on its own. The second trial was held in 1917. The year between the first trial and the second had not produced new evidence. The physical record remained as it had been. What changed in the second trial was the posture of the defense, which mounted a more direct and aggressive challenge to the authenticity of the confession, and brought forward arguments pointing in another direction entirely. The alternative theory, as it was presented in the second trial, held that the murders had been carried out by a hired killer acting at the direction of someone with a documented grievance against Josiah Moore, a line of argument that redirected the jury's attention away from Kelly and toward a different account of what had happened and why. The documentary record of Frank Jones's business relationship with Josiah Moore had been part of the investigative landscape from an early stage. Jones, an Iowa state senator, had employed Moore before Moore's departure to establish a competing implement dealership. The rivalry that followed was documented, not invented, not speculated, but recorded in the investigative material that had accumulated in the years since the killings. The defense's use of this material in the second trial was not the introduction of something new. It was the reframing of something already present in the record, directed now toward the jury, as an alternative explanation that the evidence in the defense's argument supported at least as well as the theory that Kelly had acted alone. Whether the jury found that alternative persuasive, or whether they found the challenge to the confession itself sufficient, the outcome was the same. The second trial ended in George Kelly's acquittal. The verdict was entered in the court record, a documented legal outcome that ended the prosecution of Kelly without establishing his guilt and without establishing anyone else's. The question of who had committed the murders on East 2nd Street remained exactly as open after the acquittal as it had been before the first trial began. There is a particular quality to a legal proceeding that moves at length through its formal stages and arrives at an outcome that does not answer the question that motivated it. The trials of George Kelly were not brief. The first had gone far enough for the jury's division to be understood as a substantive response to a substantive difficulty. The second had gone further still, with both sides returning to the same fundamental terrain, the same contested confession, the same absent physical evidence, the same fractured evidentiary record, and presenting their cases again with the knowledge that the first jury had been unable to decide. The second jury decided, and the decision was acquittal, and that decision was final. The confession, as it had been described and contested across both trials, had a history of its own. Kelly had made statements about the murders. Some of those statements in the account given by investigators had included details that were taken as evidence of direct knowledge of the crime. Details investigators had argued that only someone present in the house that night could have known. Kelly's counter-account held that the statements had been shaped by the conditions under which they were given, that the details attributed to him had not been provided in the way that investigators described, and that the confession as a document was not an accurate record of what he had actually said or admitted. 2 trials had been built around that disagreement, and 2 juries had engaged with it, and the second jury's acquittal represented the legal system's final answer on the question of Kelly's culpability, not proven. The absence of physical evidence connecting Kelly to the crime scene was a structural fact of the prosecution's position in both trials. The contamination of the scene in the hours after discovery, the foot traffic through the rooms, the handling of objects, the movement of officials and residents through the house before any systematic forensic examination could be conducted, had ensured from the earliest days of the case that the physical record would be compromised. By 1916, when the first trial was held, that compromise was 4 years old and irreversible. Nothing recovered from the scene, and nothing examined in the course of the original investigation had produced a piece of physical evidence that pointed specifically and unambiguously at Kelly. The prosecution's case was a case built on words, on statements, on a contested confession, on the documented circumstances of Kelly's presence in Villisca on the night of June 9th, and his departure on the morning of June 10th. Words, as the juries found, were not enough. The departure from Villisca on the morning of June 10th, 1912, had been part of the investigative record from the beginning. Kelly had attended the Children's Day program at the Presbyterian Church on the evening of June 9th. He had been in the town. He had left on an early morning train on June 10th, which was the morning the bodies were found. The documented fact of that departure, confirmed, recorded, present in the investigative material, had given investigators reason to look at him closely in the first place. In the context of a prosecution, it placed him in the town at the right time and placed his departure in close proximity to the discovery. But proximity is not presence, and presence is not guilt, and the legal standard that a jury is asked to apply demands more than documented proximity to a time and place. There is something worth attending to in the specific nature of the hung jury in the first trial. 12 people had heard the evidence. 12 people had deliberated. 12 people had been unable to agree. The division among jurors was a documented outcome, a legal fact recorded in the court record, and it was a reflection of the genuine difficulty that sat at the center of the Kelly prosecution. The confession was either a reliable account of an admission freely given, or it was not. The evidence would not resolve that question in one direction or the other, because the evidence that could have resolved it, physical evidence from the crime scene, independent corroboration of the confession's details, had either never existed or had been lost before it could be gathered and preserved. The jury's division was, in a sense, the honest response of 12 people to a case in which the available material genuinely supported more than one interpretation. Between the two trials, the defense had the opportunity to examine the prosecution's case and to consider how the arguments had landed with the first jury. The more aggressive posture of the second trial, the challenge to the confession's authenticity, the direct pointing toward the Jones-Mansfield theory as an alternative, reflected the reality that a mere repetition of the first trial's dynamics was unlikely to produce a different result for the defense. What the defense needed in the second trial was not just to challenge the confession, but to displace it, to give the jury a coherent alternative account to which the absence of physical evidence against Kelly could be attached as confirmation rather than merely noted as an absence. The acquittal suggests that the strategy was effective, or at least that the reasonable doubt it was designed to produce was sufficient to prevent conviction. The acquittal in 1917 was the last legal action taken in the Villisca murder case. No one else was charged. No further prosecution was brought. The legal chapter of the case, which had opened with Kelly's arrest in 1916, closed with his acquittal in 1917, and after that, the case moved from the active docket to something closer to a historical record, investigated, prosecuted, adjudicated, and unresolved. The court record contained the outcomes of two trials, both of them documented, neither of them producing a conviction. That was the legal legacy of the Moore family murders, a file with charges and verdicts, and no guilty party named. The question of what the confession actually said and how it had been obtained did not disappear with the acquittal. The documents remained. The investigators who had gathered Kelly's statements remained, at least for a time, available to describe the conditions under which those statements were made. What the acquittal established, legally, was that the evidence as presented at trial was insufficient to prove Kelly's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. It did not establish that Kelly had been falsely accused, in the sense that a legal finding would establish such a thing. It established that the prosecution had not met its burden, and that the jury had found accordingly. These are different findings, and the distinction between them is worth holding clearly, because conflating them produces a conclusion the record does not support. The years between the murders and the trials had not passed quietly from the investigation's point of view. The competing private detective agencies that had been engaged by different interested parties in the period after the discovery had continued to operate in parallel, pursuing different suspects toward different conclusions, their work accumulating without converging. Frank Jones had retained investigators. Other parties had engaged their own. The private investigator James Newton Wilkerson had pursued the theory connecting Jones to a hired killer and had built a circumstantial case that he continued to press through the period before and during the trials. The result, by the time the courtroom proceedings began, was an investigative background that was crowded and factional, multiple theories in active circulation, multiple sets of findings available for competing use. The original evidentiary record already lost beneath the layers of subsequent investigation. That crowded background made itself felt in the courtroom. The defense's use of the Jones-Mansfield theory in the second trial drew on material that had been developed in that factional investigative landscape, and the prosecution's reliance on the confession was itself a consequence of the same landscape. A record so compromised in its physical dimensions that the testimonial evidence of statements and admissions had become the primary evidentiary resource available to anyone attempting to build a case for guilt. A different origin, a carefully preserved crime scene, a coordinated investigation from the first hours of discovery might have produced a different body of evidence from which a prosecution could have been constructed. The prosecution that was actually built worked with what was actually available, and what was available was not enough. The first trial began in 1916, which meant that it opened in front of an Iowa jury that had lived for 4 years with the knowledge that the Moore family and the Stillinger girls had been killed in their beds. The case had not been forgotten in those 4 years. It had been reported on, discussed, investigated by multiple parties, and developed into a subject of considerable public attention across Iowa and beyond. The jury pool from which 12 people were selected would have had some familiarity with the case in its broad outlines, whatever the evidentiary specifics. The question of whether that familiarity shaped the deliberations, whether 4 years of public attention to the case created a context in which the confession seemed more or less believable than it might have in a vacuum, is not answerable from the documentary record. What the record shows is the outcome: division in the first trial, acquittal in the second. The second trial's acquittal did not produce a public settling of the question. The competing theories remained in circulation after the verdict. The Jones-Mansfield hypothesis, which the defense had deployed to good effect in the second trial, was not abandoned simply because Kelly had been found not guilty. The investigative material that had accumulated in support of that theory continued to be held by those who had assembled it, and the question of whether a hired killer had been responsible for the Moore family murders remained a live subject of discussion and inquiry for years after the legal proceedings closed. An acquittal resolves a prosecution. It does not resolve a case. There is something in the specific texture of the Kelly trials that illuminates, in a quiet way, the difficulty that runs through the Villisca case from its earliest hours. The case was always one in which the most important evidentiary work could not be done in the way it needed to be done. The crime scene was contaminated before it could be systematically examined. The physical evidence that might have connected a specific person to the events of that night was either never recovered or was lost in the noise of the first hours. The investigations that followed were divided against themselves, each agency pursuing its own theory on behalf of its own client. By the time a prosecution was possible, what remained was a disputed confession and a set of circumstances: Kelly's presence at the church, his departure on the morning of discovery, his later statements about the murders that could be read as suspicious or as coincidental, depending on which account of the confession was believed. The jury in the second trial chose the reading that produced an acquittal. The legal system moved through its stages and arrived at a final outcome. The case remained open. A courtroom is a place where the formal procedures of the law are applied to the available evidence in order to determine whether guilt can be established to the required standard. It is not a place where truth is always found, because truth depends on the evidence available to reveal it, and the evidence available to the prosecution in 1916 and 1917 was the evidence that the first hours of June 10th, 1912, had left behind, incomplete, contaminated, and divided among competing investigators who were working at cross purposes. The trials of George Kelly were, in this sense, an honest reflection of the evidentiary situation they had been asked to resolve. Two juries engaged seriously with genuinely difficult material and produced outcomes that the record of the case made understandable, if not satisfying. The formal legal record of the Villisca case contains two trials, one hung jury and one acquittal. It contains a charge of murder laid against a named defendant, a contested confession, and a documented absence of physical evidence connecting the defendant to the crime scene. It contains the outcome of both proceedings, entered in the court record in the appropriate form, final in the legal sense that court records are final. What it does not contain is a conviction. What it does not name is a guilty party. What it does not close is the question of who was in the Moore home on the night of June 9th to 10, 1912, and what happened there. The years between the murders and the arrest of Kelly had allowed the case to accumulate around itself a substantial body of investigative material, statements, theories, circumstantial evidence, competing reports from competing agencies. The years between the arrest and the trials had allowed Kelly's own legal position to be developed, the challenge to the confession to be sharpened, the alternative theory to be prepared for courtroom presentation. By the time the second trial closed, the case had been worked on intensively for more than 5 years by multiple investigators, private and official, and had passed through the formal structures of the legal system. And the answer at the end of all of that was no different from the answer that had stood in the first confused hours of June 10th, 1912, unknown. The acquittal in 1917 is perhaps best understood as the point at which the legal system acknowledged, in its formal way, what the evidentiary record had been indicating for some time. The record was insufficient to convict. The record was insufficient to exonerate, in any broader sense. The record was what it was, fragmented, contested, built on a foundation that had been compromised at its origin and had not been recoverable in the years that followed. What the court could do with that record, it did. The verdict was entered. The proceeding was closed. George Kelly left the legal proceedings as a man who had been charged, tried twice, and acquitted. The formal designation of his legal status after 1917 was that of a person against whom the prosecution had not met its burden. That is the documented, legal, court-recorded fact of his situation. The question of what he knew, what he had seen, what he had done or not done in connection with the events at the Moore home was not resolved by the acquittal and was not resolvable from the evidence that survived. The case file holds his name as a subject of investigation, as a defendant in 2 trials, as a man who denied the confession attributed to him and was ultimately acquitted by a jury that found the evidence insufficient. That is the shape of his presence in the record. The same distance in time that had made the original crime scene difficult to work from in 1916 continued to widen after the acquittal. By the 1920s, the physical evidence from the house on East 2nd Street had been further degraded or dispersed. The investigators who had conducted the original inquiry had moved on. Some of them or died or had their notes and files scattered among the private and public archives that hold such things. The case did not have a single custodian with the authority and the resources to maintain it as an active investigation and pursue it through the years after the trials closed. It became what old unresolved cases become, a documented record held in multiple places, a subject of ongoing interest to researchers and writers, a file with an outcome noted, no conviction, and a question standing unanswered in the space where an answer should have been. The quietness of a legal proceeding's close is different from the quietness of a case that has been solved. When a conviction follows a trial, the courtroom's closing has the specific quality of a thing finished. The legal mechanism has run its course. The question of guilt has been answered to the law's satisfaction. The file can be marked accordingly. When an acquittal follows without solving the underlying question, when the defendant is cleared, not because the investigation established another answer, but because the evidence was insufficient to prove the charge, the courtroom's closing has a different quality entirely. The mechanism has run its course. The file cannot be marked with an answer because no answer has been established. The legal chapter closes. The case remains. That is the documented condition of the Villisca murders after 1917, 2 trials in an Iowa courtroom, with all the formality and procedural seriousness that such proceedings carry. A contested confession and the documented absence of physical evidence and the structural failure of the original investigation working its effects outward through the years into a courtroom where the prosecution had to work with what remained. A hung jury in the first trial and an acquittal in the second, and after that the long stillness of a case that has been through the legal system and come out the other side without resolution. The court records of the 2 Kelly trials are documents and archives. The finding in each hung jury, acquittal, is entered in the formal record as court findings are entered, permanent in the way that official records are permanent. The names are there: Kelly charged, Kelly tried, Kelly acquitted. The name that is not there is the name of the person or persons who were in the Moore home on the night of June 9th to 10, 1912. That name, if it was ever in any record at all, has not been connected to the events of that night in a form that any legal proceeding or any forensic review has been able to confirm. The court records hold what the legal system found. What the legal system found was the limit of what the evidence could support and nothing beyond it. The specific fact of George Kelly's acquittal in 1917, documented, final, a matter of court record, closed the last active legal proceeding in the Villisca case. No charges were brought against Frank Jones. No charges were brought against William Mansfield. No third trial followed the second. The legal apparatus that had been engaged by Kelly's arrest in 1916 ran its course, produced its outcome, and went quiet. The case did not go quiet with it, in the sense that it continued to be investigated, researched, and discussed in the years that followed. But the legal chapter, the arrests, the trials, the verdicts, was complete, and it was complete without a conviction, and the completion of that chapter, without a conviction, is the documented legal legacy of the murders at 508 East 2nd Street. There is a kind of rest in following a formal process through to its conclusion, even when the conclusion is not an answer. The trials of George Kelly were a serious engagement with a serious case, imperfect, built on compromised materials, ultimately unable to produce a conviction, but genuine in their procedural form, attentive in their way to the demands of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, reflective of the difficulty of the evidentiary situation that the original failures of the inquiry had created. 2 juries engaged with the question. Neither found the evidence sufficient for a guilty verdict. The legal question was answered. The underlying question was not. The acquittal in 1917 stands in the court record, as it has always stood, a documented outcome. Neither a resolution of the case nor an exoneration in any broader historical sense. Simply the legal system's final word on the prosecution of George Jacqueline Kelly for the murders of the Moore family and the Stillinger girls. The courtroom that heard the second trial has long since moved through other cases and other years. The verdict that emerged from it is the last formal legal action the record shows. After 1917, the Villisca murders belonged to the long open, unclosed territory of the unresolved, held there still in the archives and the court records and the investigative files, a case that went to trial and came back without an answer, exactly as the evidence had always suggested it would. In the years following the murders at 508 East 2nd Street, a researcher named Edgar Epperly spent considerable time building something patient and methodical, a map assembled from documented records of axe murder cases that had occurred across the American Midwest in the years between approximately 1909 and 1912. Each case on that map was a confirmed incident. Each one had a location, a date, a count of victims, and a body of investigative material that had accumulated around it, and then, in most instances, gone quiet without resolution. Epperly placed them together not to tell a dramatic story, but to ask a documented question: whether the physical signatures of these separate cases, examined together across the span of several years in several states, revealed a pattern that individual investigations had not been positioned to see. The work was comparative and careful. It moved across Iowa and Kansas and the states that bordered them, and it treated each case as a separate evidentiary record first, before asking what those records might share. The question Epperly was following was not whether a single killer had committed all of these crimes. That was a conclusion the evidence could not support, but whether the documented details of how the crimes had been carried out were consistent enough across multiple scenes and multiple years to suggest that possibility as a serious investigative hypothesis. This was the specific and measured claim his research produced, and it remained, as he understood and stated, a circumstantial one. What the comparative record showed when the cases were placed alongside one another was a set of recurring physical signatures, victims in their beds, the blunt pole of the axe used rather than the blade, bedclothes replaced or drawn back over the victims after death, a killer who, in the documented evidence from multiple scenes, appeared to have remained inside the house for a period of time after the attacks were complete. These details appeared at the Moore home in Villisca. They appeared in cases documented in Ellsworth and Palaska, Kansas, in the same general period. The Kansas cases, like the Villisca case, involved multiple victims killed while they slept. The manner of the attacks consistent across scenes in ways that investigators who had followed both sets of records found worth noting and recording. What the research could not establish, and what Epperly did not claim to establish, was the identity of whoever had moved through those houses in the night, or whether the same person had moved through all of them. The pattern was in the record. The answer was not. The Ellsworth case had its own documentary history, its own investigative file, its own accumulation of followed and unfollowed leads. The Paola case similarly. Each one had been investigated locally by the law enforcement agencies and investigative resources available in the years immediately following the killings, and each one had closed or stalled without a definitive resolution. What Epperly's research did, in placing them together, was create a broader frame around each individual case, a context that had not been available to investigators working in 1909 or 1910 or 1912, each of them confined to the jurisdiction and the evidence that was immediately in front of them, with no mechanism for comparing their findings to what was being documented 200 miles away in another state at approximately the same time. The comparison, once made, did not resolve any of the cases. It could not do that. What it produced instead was a documented argument for a hypothesis that a traveling killer moving between communities in the Midwest may have been responsible for more than one of these attacks, and that argument found a place in the scholarly and investigative record as exactly what it was, a carefully assembled circumstantial case built by a named researcher working from confirmed facts that remained unconfirmed as a matter of law enforcement conclusion or court finding. Epperly named his evidence, he named his reasoning, he named the limits of what the evidence allowed him to say. That is the form in which the hypothesis exists in the record, and it is the form in which it has persisted. The William Mansfield theory, which connected the comparative murder case research to the private investigation work conducted around Frank Jones and the documented business rivalry with Josiah Moore, occupied a related portion of the scholarly record. Mansfield had been identified by private investigator James Newton Wilkerson as a potential hired killer, and the circumstantial links between Mansfield and axe murders in Kansas and other Midwestern states had been documented in the investigative files that Wilkerson assembled. Those files remained what they were, a private investigator's documented working theory, built from circumstantial evidence, never confirmed by law enforcement, and never adjudicated in a court that reached a verdict on the question. The theory did not disappear from the record after the legal proceedings ended. It remained in the archived material, held alongside the other theories and the evidence that supported and failed to support each of them. The Moore home at 508 East 2nd Street was not demolished in the decades following the murders. The structure remains standing on its residential block in Villisca, a wood frame house. 2 stories, its address unchanged, its physical presence on the street continuous with the building that had been there in June of 1912. For many of those intervening decades, it changed hands in the ordinary way that houses change hands, and the history it held became the kind of local knowledge that accumulates in a small community around a place associated with an unresolved and significant event. The town of Villisca kept its own relationship to what had happened there, and the house at 508 East 2nd Street remained part of that relationship, standing quietly on its block as the years accumulated around it. In 1994, the property was purchased by Darwin and Martha Lynn. The work they undertook on the structure was restoration work directed toward returning the house to its approximate appearance in 1912, recovering the physical details of the building as it had been in the year the murders occurred. The restoration was not a reconstruction from scratch. The underlying structure was the same structure, the walls and floors continuous with what had been there, the address unchanged, the lot the same. What the restoration work did was attend to the outward appearance of the building, bringing its condition and its details into alignment with the documented historical record of how the house had looked when the Moore family lived in it. The house was subsequently listed on the National Register of Historic Places. That listing gave it a formal designation within the federal preservation system, a documented status confirming its significance as a historic property, its physical connection to a confirmed historical event, its standing as something worth preserving rather than replacing. The address was recorded in that listing exactly as it had always been. The building's walls and ceilings, the rooms where 8 people had slept on the night of June 9th, 1912, were part of what the listing recognized and what the preservation work protected. The rooms of the restored Moore home today bear the documented physical layout of the house as it was in 1912. The downstairs bedroom where the Stillinger girls slept is still a room on the ground floor of a residential structure. The upstairs bedrooms where the Moore family slept are still rooms above it. The ceilings of those upstairs rooms carry their own documented history. The gouge marks recorded by investigators in the days after the murders were a permanent physical record of what had happened in each of those spaces, impressions left in the plaster that no subsequent investigation needed to imagine, because they were there in the material fabric of the building as long as the building stood. Whether those specific marks survived the decades and the restoration work in their original form is a question the documented record does not fully answer. What the record does confirm is that the building survived, that its essential structure is continuous with the 1912 structure, and that it stands today at the same address where it stood on the morning of June 10th, 1912, when the bodies were first found. The house has attracted visitors across the years since the restoration, people who have come to Villisca for the specific purpose of standing in or near the building, some drawn by the history of the case and its place in the documented record, some drawn by the more popular interest in the house as a site of paranormal investigation and reported phenomena. The two categories of interest are not the same thing, and the documented record holds them differently. The case history is in the investigative files, the court records, the comparative research, the newspaper archives, the scholarly work. The reports of unexplained phenomena in and around the house are a separate category of documented material, accounts of reported experiences, not findings that law enforcement or forensic investigators have evaluated as evidence of anything beyond the reported experiences themselves. In November of 2014, an event occurred inside the Moore home that entered the public record as a criminal matter. A man named Robert Stephen Lawrence, present in the house as part of an overnight paranormal investigation, stabbed himself during that investigation. He survived. He was charged with criminal mischief for damage caused inside the house during the incident. The legal proceedings that followed produced a finding. Lawrence was found not guilty by reason of insanity. That finding is a matter of court record, a documented legal outcome held in the same category of verifiable fact as any other court record, separate from interpretation or commentary about what it means. Lawrence survived. The house remained. The damage was documented. The legal finding was entered. The house continued to stand at its address in Villisca. The case for a traveling Midwestern killer, the hypothesis developed from the comparative research Epperly and others pursued, did not require the paranormal history of the house to have weight. Its weight, such as it was, came from the documented crime scene details, the geographic distribution of the confirmed cases, and the recurring physical signatures that investigators and researchers identified across multiple scenes. Those were evidentiary facts. The hypothesis built from them was a reasoned argument from circumstantial evidence, not a confirmed conclusion, but it was grounded in documented material rather than in reported experience or popular belief. The distinction matters, and the record holds it carefully. What the behavioral signatures that researchers cataloged across the linked cases consisted of was a specific and repeating set of documented details. The choice of the blunt pole of the axe rather than the blade was one of them, a detail noted at Villisca, documented in investigators' notes, and recorded in comparative analyses of the other cases. The replacement of bedclothes over victims after death was another, a documented action, requiring deliberate movement, noted consistently across the scenes that formed the basis of the comparative case. The apparent absence of significant struggle at any of the scenes, consistent with victims having been killed while asleep, was a third. The killer's apparent lingering in the house after the attacks, evidenced at Villisca by the covered mirrors and lamp chimneys, and the time required to have moved through the house performing those acts, was a fourth. Each of these details was individually documented. Their recurrence across multiple scenes was what the comparative research identified as significant, a pattern that individual investigations working only from their own scenes, had not been positioned to examine the question of whether those signatures, taken together, constituted evidence of a single actor moving between communities, or were instead a coincidental clustering of similar methods in a period when axe murders were not uniquely rare in the rural Midwest. That question has not been answered by the record. It remains where Epperly and others left it, a documented hypothesis, supported by circumstantial evidence, unresolved by anything that constitutes a definitive investigative conclusion. The Villisca case itself has a confirmed current status. It is officially unsolved. No perpetrator has been identified by law enforcement to a standard that has produced a conviction or a formal closure. The two trials that followed the 1912 murders, the first ending in a hung jury, the second in an acquittal, produced legal outcomes without producing an answer to the underlying question. The private detective agencies, whose competing investigations characterized the years immediately following the murders, produced documented files without producing a definitive resolution. The comparative research produced a hypothesis without producing a confirmation. The physical evidence from the crime scene was contaminated in the hours after discovery and further degraded across more than a century to a point where a forensically conclusive resolution, in the judgment of those who have examined the surviving material, is extremely unlikely. The case file exists. It is open. The question it holds is the same question it has held since the morning of June 10th, 1912. The house at 508 East 2nd Street sits in that context. It is a specific physical building at a specific address in Villisca, Iowa, a small town in the southwestern part of the state, with a population that has changed across more than a century, but that has held through all of those changes a particular relationship to what happened on East 2nd Street in the summer of 1912. The building is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Its walls are the walls of the house where 8 people slept on the night of June 9th. Its address is the address investigators recorded when they arrived on the morning of June 10th. Nothing about the building's essential identity has changed, not its location on the street, not its relationship to the town around it, not the documented history it carries. What the restoration work of 1994 produced was a building whose outward appearance was returned as closely as possible to what it had been in the year the murders occurred. The rooms were restored to approximate their 1912 configuration. The exterior details were attended to. The house was brought into a form that corresponded as closely as the surviving evidence and available research could manage to the form it had held on the evening of June 9th, 1912, when Sarah Moore and the children came home from the Presbyterian church, when the Stillinger girls settled into the downstairs guest room, and when the household went quiet sometime before 11 o'clock in the evening. The restoration was not a gesture of drama. It was a preservation decision, a practical and documented choice made by the people who purchased the property, directed toward maintaining a historic structure in a form consistent with its documented historical significance. The National Register listing formalized what the restoration expressed, that the building at 508 East 2nd Street is a physical object of historical record, continuous with its own past, worth preserving rather than removing. That is the category it occupies in the formal preservation system of the United States. Entered there, not because of the murders specifically, but because of the building's relationship to a documented historical event of confirmed significance. The case file, as it currently exists, is distributed across several kinds of archives. There are local archives in Iowa that hold investigative material from the original 1912 inquiry and the years that followed. There are court records from the 1916 and 1917 trials, the proceedings against Reverend George Kelly, the hung jury, the acquittal. There is the accumulated work of private detective agencies, whose files, in varying states of completeness and preservation, have become part of the broader documentary record of the case. There is the comparative research Epperly and others produced, published, and archived in academic and historical contexts. There are newspaper records from 1912 and the subsequent years capturing the contemporaneous account of the discovery, the investigation, the legal proceedings, and the public's long engagement with the unanswered question at the center of the case. All of this material exists. It is held in the various repositories that hold such things. It accumulates there, as it has accumulated for more than a century, without adding up to a final answer. The nature of the evidentiary situation at Villisca, the contamination of the crime scene in the hours after discovery, the competing private investigations, the loss and degradation of physical evidence across time, is not unique in the documented history of American criminal investigation. Cases from the same era, the early decades of the 20th century, frequently left similar records, incomplete, contested, accumulated through imperfect processes, and ultimately insufficient to resolve the central question by any standard that modern investigation or jurisprudence would require. What is particular to Villisca is the specific shape of the failure, the way the contamination happened, the specific nature of the competing investigations, the precise form of the evidentiary gap that existed by the time the trials were held. That particularity is in the record. The pattern it belongs to is wider. There is something that persists in the Villisca record that goes beyond the investigative failures and the evidentiary losses. It is the simple documented fact of 8 people, 6 of them children, in a house on a residential street in a small Iowa town on an evening that had been entirely ordinary up to the moment it stopped being ordinary. Josiah Moore, age 36, who ran an implement dealership on the main street of Villisca, Sarah Moore, age 39, who had helped organize the evening's church program, Herman and Mary Catherine, and Arthur and Paul, and Boyd, and infant Lena Gertrude, distributed across the upstairs rooms of the family home. Lena and Ina Stillinger, daughters of a local farmer, sleeping in the downstairs guest room after an informal arrangement made at the close of a community gathering, the kind of arrangement that was entirely unremarkable in a town where most residents knew most other residents by name. 8 people, asleep, in a house that looked from the outside exactly like every other house on the block. The documentation of those 8 people, their names, their ages, their relationships, the specific evening that brought them together in that house, is part of the case record. It is the part of the record that does not depend on investigative conclusions or evidentiary sufficiency or legal findings. It is simply what was confirmed and documented about who they were and where they were on the night of June 9th, 1912. That part of the record does not have an open question attached to it. It is settled fact, held in the archive alongside all the things that are not settled, all the questions that the archive has held for more than a century without being able to answer them. The town of Villisca is still there. It is a small town in Montgomery County, Iowa. Its population smaller now than the approximately 2,500 residents who lived there in 1912. Its streets quiet in the way that small Midwestern towns are quiet. Or its relationship to its own history, carried in the local knowledge and local memory that such communities accumulate over time. The case is part of that local history in a specific and confirmed way, not as legend or folklore, though the distance of more than a century has given it the texture that distance gives to unresolved things. but as a documented event that happened to actual people who lived in that town and whose names are in the record. East 2nd Street is still a residential street. The houses along it are the kind of houses that populate residential streets in small Midwestern towns. Wood frame structures, set back from the sidewalk, their lots bounded by the ordinary geography of a neighborhood. The house at 508 is among them, restored to its approximate 1912 appearance, listed on the National Register, open to visitors who make their way to Villisca for any of the several reasons that draw people there. It stands on its lot at its address, its structure continuous with the structure that was there on the morning of June 10th, 1912, its walls the same walls, its rooms holding the same documented history they have always held. The question of who entered that house on the night of June 9th, 1912, has not been answered. The investigation produced suspects, Frank Fernando Jones, whose documented business rivalry with Josiah Moore formed the evidentiary basis of one theory. Reverend George Kelly, whose documented departure on the morning of the discovery and whose contested statements formed the basis of the prosecution. William Mansfield, whose circumstantial connections to axe murders across the Midwest formed part of the private investigative theory. None of those names produced a conviction. None of them was established as the answer by any legal or investigative finding that the record recognizes as definitive. The question remained open when Kelly was acquitted in 1917. It remained open through the decades of comparative research and scholarly examination that followed. It remains open today as a matter of confirmed official record. The passage of time has not made the case easier to revisit in any evidentiary sense. The physical evidence that was lost to contamination in the hours after discovery on June 10, 1912. The footprints, the fingerprints, the trace materials that might have been documented before they were disturbed cannot be recovered by any subsequent review. What was not collected in 1912 is not in the archive. What was handled and displaced by the residents and officials who moved through the house before forensic examination began is irretrievable. The case file holds what survived that process, and what survived was enough to support a century of investigative attention without being enough to produce a resolution. That is the honest shape of the record, and it has not changed. The document trail that researchers and investigators have followed since the 1912 murders is long and accumulates across many institutional forms. Newspaper archives, court transcripts, private investigative files, coroner's records, historical research, comparative case analyses. Each of these bodies of material adds something to the record without completing it. A detail here, a contextual frame there, a documented timeline point, or a named finding that refines the picture without resolving it. The record grows, the answer does not arrive. This is not a failure unique to the Villisca case. It is the condition of many cases from the same era, when the investigative and forensic infrastructure available to law enforcement was far less developed than what exists today, and when the loss of evidence in the critical hours after a crime's discovery was common and often irreversible. What makes the Villisca record particular within that broader context is the scale of what happened in a community, small enough that 8 people represented a significant portion of local life. Josiah Moore was a businessman known in the town. Sarah Moore had participated in organizing the church program on the very evening of the murders. The Stillinger girls were the daughters of a local farmer, attending the program with their family. Their overnight stay at the Moore home, the kind of informal community arrangement that small towns make without ceremony, the community's response to the discovery the residents who moved through the house, the officials who arrived without forensic training, the curiosity that made the crime scene simultaneously a public event and an evidentiary ruin was itself a function of scale, of the way that devastating events in small communities draw the people of those communities toward rather than away from the place where the event occurred. The house absorbed all of that, the community response, the competing investigations, the legal proceedings, the decades of public attention, the restoration, the preservation listing, the continued stream of visitors drawn by history and by reported phenomena alike. It absorbed all of it and remained a wood frame structure at a residential address in a small Iowa town, its walls holding the documentary and physical record of a night in June 1912 without offering any more of an answer than the investigative record has produced. The building is patient in the way that buildings are patient, without intention or awareness, simply present at its address, continuous with its own past. The researchers who have spent years with the Villisca material, Epperly among them, and the investigators and historians whose work has added to the accumulating record across the decades have been patient in a different sense. Their patience has been directed and purposeful, sustained by the specific hope that the record, examined carefully enough and compared widely enough, might yield something it had not previously been willing to give. In some ways, the comparative research produced exactly that, a wider frame, a documented hypothesis, a more precise articulation of what the physical signatures of the Villisca murders shared with the documented signatures of other cases in the region and the period. What it did not produce was the name the record has never held. That name, if it exists anywhere, and the probability approaches certainty that a specific person carried it, is not in the investigative files. It is not in the court records. It is not in the comparative research. It is not in the archive of any institution that has examined the case across more than a century of cumulative attention. The person who entered the Moore home on the night of June 9th, 1912, was never identified to the evidentiary standard required for a definitive legal conclusion, and the physical evidence that might have supported such an identification is gone. The case is open in the specific sense that no answer has been placed in the record to close it. It will remain open in that sense, held by the official record as unsolved, classified in the category of unresolved historical cases, its file present in the archives of the institutions that maintain such files, unchanged in its essential status by anything that has occurred since 1917. The house at 508 East 2nd Street sits at the end of that long record, the way a sentence sits at the end of a long passage, not as a conclusion, because the record does not have one, but as the specific physical object through which all of the accumulated history passes. The restoration returned it to its 1912 appearance, as closely as the surviving evidence allowed. The National Register listing confirmed its place in the preserved historical record of the United States.